Sometimes life gives you a second chance when you least expect it. And sometimes all it takes is a scruffy little dog to open a door you thought was closed forever. Clara Whitmore is a widow in her early 60s, arriving in Montana with nothing but debts and a puppy named Whiskey. She needs work at Grant Delaney's ranch, a wealthy cattleman who hasn't smiled since his brother died. She apologizes for bringing the dog. Instead, Grant picks up the pup and smiles. What begins as temporary work becomes something neither expected. Can two broken hearts truly find healing again? Before we jump back in, I want to hear from you. Tell us where you're tuning in from today. And if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Something truly meaningful that I think you're really going to love. The mountains came into view just past noon, their peaks dusted with early October snow, sharp and familiar against a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Clara Whitmore eased her foot off the gas pedal as the old Honda crested the ridge, letting the car roll slowly down toward the valley she hadn't seen in 40 years. Whiskey shifted in the passenger seat, his scruffy head poking up from the threadbare blanket she'd tucked around him. Black button eyes watching her with that particular brand of concern only dogs seemed capable of. "I know." "Buddy," she murmured, reaching over to scratch behind his ears. "I'm nervous too." The highway wound through stands of pine and aspen, their leaves turning gold and amber in the cooling air. This stretch of Montana had always been beautiful. She'd forgotten how beautiful, or maybe she'd forced herself to forget. There were too many memories here, too many roads not taken. She'd been 22 when she left Pinewood for college in Seattle. Bright-eyed and eager, convinced that her life would be lived in cities, in classrooms full of students, in a world much larger than this valley could contain. She'd been right about some of it. She'd taught English literature for 35 years, shaped young minds, made a difference in ways both small and profound. She'd married Tom Whitmore 3 months after graduation, a kind and steady man who worked as an engineer and loved her with a quiet devotion that never wavered. They'd built a good life together in a modest house in Tacoma. No children, which had been a sorrow for a while, but they'd filled their days with students, volunteer work, hiking trips, and the gentle rhythms of a marriage built on friendship as much as love. And then Tom got sick. Clara's hands tightened on the steering wheel, her wedding ring catching the afternoon light. The simple gold band had lived on her left hand for 37 years now, 2 years of engagement and 35 of marriage. She'd worn it through Tom's diagnosis of pancreatic cancer, through the brutal months of chemotherapy that stole his hair and his appetite and his strength, through the hospice days when all she could do was hold his hand and tell him it was okay to let go. She'd worn it through the funeral, through the weeks of sorting through their shared life, through the gradual, devastating realization that Tom's illness had consumed not just his life, but their savings as well. Medical bills, experimental treatments their insurance wouldn't cover, the second mortgage they'd taken out in desperate hope. It had all added up to a debt she couldn't carry on a teacher's pension. She'd sold the house, sold most of their possessions, and still found herself $40,000 in the red with nowhere left to turn, except here, except home. The sign for Pinewood appeared on her right, weathered wood, announcing a population of 1,247. She wondered if that number had grown or shrunk since her childhood. Probably shrunk. Places like this usually did, the young people leaving for opportunities elsewhere. The old-timers hanging on out of stubbornness or love or simple inertia. She drove slowly down Main Street, past the feed store and the post office and Murphy's Hardware, all of them looking exactly as they had 4 decades ago, as if time itself had decided to take a nap here. A few new businesses had crept in, a coffee shop with cheerful yellow awnings, a craft store advertising quilting supplies, but the bones of the town remained unchanged. Clara found the Pinewood Motor Lodge without difficulty. It sat at the far end of Main Street, a low-slung building with turquoise doors and a sign promising clean rooms, fair prices. Pets welcome. That last part had sealed it for her when she'd called to book a room. She couldn't afford much, but she wouldn't leave whiskey behind. He'd been Tom's last gift to her, a scrappy terrier mix from the shelter that Tom had brought home 3 weeks before he died. "You need someone to take care of," Tom had said, his voice already weak, his hand trembling as he'd placed the puppy in her lap. "Someone who needs you as much as you need him." He'd been right about that too. The motel room was exactly what she'd expected. Small, clean, smelling faintly of pine cleaner and old carpet. A double bed with a faded floral spread, a television bolted to the dresser, a bathroom barely large enough to turn around in. She set her single battered suitcase on the bed and filled a bowl with water for Whiskey, who immediately began exploring every corner of the room with thorough enthusiasm. Clara sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself, just for a moment, to feel the full weight of her exhaustion. She'd driven for 2 days straight from Tacoma, sleeping in rest stops and eating gas station sandwiches, her body aching and her heart heavier than any physical burden she'd ever carried. She was 62 years old, widowed, nearly broke, and desperate for work in a town that had probably forgotten she'd ever existed. She reached for her purse and pulled out the folded newspaper clipping she'd been carrying for 3 weeks. She'd found it while searching online for jobs in Montana, a small article in the Pinewood Gazette about the autumn cattle auction. Buried in the article was a single sentence that had caught her attention. Grant Delaney, owner of the largest ranch in the valley, reported strong sales this year despite operating without a ranch manager since March. Without a ranch manager. That meant he needed help. Clara had administrative experience. She'd managed department budgets, coordinated schedules, handled paperwork for hundreds of students. It wasn't ranching, but it was something. And Grant Delaney was a name she remembered from her youth, though she'd never met him. The Delaneys had always been the wealthy family in the valley, their ranch spanning thousands of acres up in the foothills. Grant would have been just a child when she left. Maybe 10 or 12 years old. She'd called the ranch that afternoon, her hands shaking as she dialed. A man had answered, his voice deep and guarded. "Delaney Ranch. Hello, my name is Clara Whitmore. I'm calling about the ranch manager position." A long pause. "Who told you about a position?" "No one exactly. I read that you've been without a manager since March, and I have administrative experience. I'm organized, good with numbers, and I'm available immediately." Another pause, longer this time. "Ma'am, this is hard work. Long hours, livestock, supply chains, payroll for a dozen hands. I understand. I'm willing to learn, and I work hard. Where are you calling from?" "Tacoma, but I'm from Pinewood originally. I'm coming back." The silence stretched so long she thought he'd hung up. "Then you can come by the ranch Monday morning, 8 o'clock. We'll talk." He'd hung up before she could thank him. That had been 3 days ago. She'd packed her car that same night and started driving. Now here she was, in a motel room that cost $45 a night she could barely afford, with a dog and a dream and very little else. Monday morning seemed both impossibly far away and terrifyingly close. She needed to eat. She needed to walk Whiskey. She needed to think. Clara clipped on Whiskey's leash, the worn red collar a reminder of Tom's hands buckling it that last time, and headed back out into the October afternoon. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves. She walked slowly back toward Main Street, letting Whiskey sniff every fence post and fire hydrant. His tail wagging with uncomplicated joy, the diner sat on the corner of Main and 3rd, a classic aluminum-sided affair called Rosie's. Through the windows, Clara could see vinyl booths and a long counter with swivel stools, the kind of place that served coffee in thick ceramic mugs and knew everyone's usual order by heart. Her stomach rumbled. She hadn't eaten anything hot in 2 days. She tied Whiskey's leash to a bench outside. The October air was cool enough that he'd be comfortable for a few minutes, and pushed through the glass door. A bell chimed overhead. The interior smelled like hamburgers and fresh coffee. A handful of customers sat scattered throughout the dining room, their conversations creating a low, comfortable hum. A woman in her 60s, grey hair pulled back in a practical bun, looked up from behind the counter and smiled. "Sit anywhere you like, hon. I'll be right with you." Clara slid into a booth near the window where she could keep an eye on Whiskey. The dog had already curled up on the bench, perfectly content. She picked up the laminated menu, though she already knew what she wanted: comfort food, something warm and filling and real. The waitress approached with a coffee pot and a smile that created deep creases around her eyes. Her name tag read Doris. Coffee? Please. Clara turned over the mug that waited at her place. Doris poured, steam rising between them. You're new in town. Or back in town, if I'm reading you right. You've got that look, like you remember things. Clara smiled despite herself. Is it that obvious? Honey, I've been pouring coffee in this place for 30 years. I know every face in Pinewood, and I know when someone's coming home. She pulled out her order pad. What can I get you? Meatloaf special if you have it. Best in the state. My mother's recipe. Doris scribbled on her pad, then paused, studying Clara with frank curiosity. You looking for work or family or both? Work, mostly. I have an appointment Monday morning with Grant Delaney. Doris's eyebrows rose. The Delaney Ranch. That's good, stable work if you can get it. Grant's a fair man, pays well, treats his people right. Keeps to himself mostly, but there's worse qualities in an employer. What's he like? Doris leaned against the booth, settling in for a proper conversation. Quiet, serious. His parents passed some years back, and his younger brother died in an accident about 5 years ago. Terrible thing, riding accident in the back pasture. Grant took it hard. He's been running that ranch alone ever since, and I mean alone. Works himself near to death from what I hear. Doesn't socialize much, doesn't date, just works and goes home. She paused, her expression softening. I suppose we all grieve in our own ways. Clara thought of Tom, of the hole his absence had carved into her days. Yes, she said quietly. We do, Doris patted her shoulder. I'll get that meatloaf going. You holler if you need anything else. Clara sipped her coffee and stared out at the street, at the mountains rising beyond the buildings, at the life she'd returned to without knowing if there was room for her in it anymore. She thought about Grant Delaney, a man shaped by loss, running a ranch meant for a family all by himself. Maybe they'd understand each other. Maybe that would be enough. The alarm on Clara's phone went off at 5:30 Monday morning, though she'd barely slept. She'd lain awake most of the night, rehearsing what she'd say to Grant Delaney, how she'd present herself, what questions he might ask. Now, in the darkness before dawn, her carefully prepared words seemed flimsy and inadequate. She showered in the cramped bathroom, dressed in the most professional clothes she'd brought: dark jeans, a cream-colored blouse, a navy cardigan that Tom had always said made her eyes look brighter. Her hands shook as she applied minimal makeup, just enough to look put together without seeming like she was trying too hard. She was 62 years old and applying for a job she wasn't qualified for, hoping that a stranger would take a chance on her. The weight of that desperation sat heavy in her chest. Whiskey watched from his spot on the bed, tail thumping hopefully. She'd fed him earlier, but now came the question that had kept her awake. Should she bring him? Grant had said to come at 8. He hadn't said anything about dogs, but whiskey was part of the package. If Grant couldn't accept that, then this wasn't the right place anyway. She clipped on his worn red collar, the leather frayed at the edges, the brass buckle slightly tarnished, and attached his leash. Come on, buddy, she murmured. Let's go see if we can find ourselves a home. The drive to the Delaney Ranch took 20 minutes. Winding north out of Pinewood on a 2-lane highway before turning onto a private gravel road marked by a simple wooden sign. Delaney Ranch, Esther 1947. Clara's Honda rattled over the cattle guard, and she found herself driving through what felt like a different world entirely. The ranch spread out before her like something from a painting. Wooden fences, perfectly maintained, stretched across rolling meadows where cattle grazed in the early morning mist. The mountains rose behind everything, their peaks catching the first golden light of sunrise. Aspens lined the drive, their leaves shimmering yellow and gold, and in the distance she could see several barns, outbuildings, and corrals, all arranged with a sense of order that spoke to generations of careful stewardship. The main house sat at the end of the drive, A sprawling log home with a wraparound porch and river rock pillars. It was beautiful in an understated way, fitting into the landscape as if it had grown there naturally. Smoke rose from one of the chimneys, and she could see lights burning in several windows. Clara pulled up in front of the house and killed the engine. Her heart hammered in her chest. She sat there for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, watching the sky lighten over the mountains. She could turn around. She could drive back to Tacoma, declare bankruptcy, start over somewhere else. She didn't have to do this, but where else was there to go? Whiskey whined softly, sensing her anxiety. "You're right," she told him. "We didn't come all this way to chicken out now." She opened the door and stepped out, her legs unsteady. Whiskey jumped down after her, immediately interested in all the new smells. Clara smoothed her cardigan, took a deep breath, and started toward the house. She made it 3 steps before she saw him. A man emerged from the barn to her left, tall and solid in the early light, wearing work jeans, a flannel shirt, and a canvas jacket. He moved with the easy confidence of someone completely at home in his surroundings, carrying a bucket in one hand. As he came closer, Clara could make out more details, probably late 50s. Weathered face with deep lines around the eyes, dark hair going grey at the temples, broad shoulders that suggested a lifetime of physical work. He stopped when he saw her, set down the bucket, and studied her with an expression that gave nothing away. Clara's carefully rehearsed speech evaporated. She was suddenly painfully aware of how she must look, a nervous widow with a dog, standing in front of a house she had no business approaching. "Mr. Delaney." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "That's right." He didn't move closer, just watched her with those steady, unreadable eyes. "I'm Clara Whitmore. We spoke on the phone about the ranch manager position, I remember." He glanced down at Whiskey, who was straining at the leash, wanting to investigate this new person. "You brought your dog, and there it was, the moment where this could all fall apart." Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks, a mixture of embarrassment and defiance. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I brought my dog. I should have mentioned it on the phone, but I was afraid you'd tell me not to come. I can't leave him behind." "I won't. So if that's a problem, I understand, and May I?" Grant gestured toward Whiskey. Clara blinked, thrown off balance by the question. Yes, of course." Grant walked over, moving slowly and deliberately, the way someone moves when they know animals. He crouched down, bringing himself to Whiskey's level, and extended his hand for the dog to sniff. Whiskey, always friendly, immediately began wagging his tail and trying to lick Grant's fingers. Grant smiled. It transformed his entire face. The serious, guarded expression softened into something warm and genuine as he scratched behind Whiskey's ears and ran his hands over the dog's scruffy coat. "Good-looking pup," he said, his voice gentler now. "Terrier mix." That's what the shelter thought. Clara's voice was unsteady. She hadn't expected this. "His name is Whiskey." Whiskey. Grant looked up at her, still smiling. "That's a good name for a ranch dog." He stood brushing his hands on his jeans. "You have ranching experience?" "No, but I have 40 years of administrative experience. I can manage budget, schedules, payroll, supply orders, inventory. I'm organized and detail-oriented, and I learn quickly." "Why Montana?" "Why now?" The question was direct but not unkind. Clara decided that honesty was her only real option. "My husband died 8 months ago. We had medical bills that ate through our savings. I needed a fresh start, and this is where I'm from originally. I saw in the paper that you'd been without a ranch manager, and I thought maybe I could help." Something flickered across Grant's face, understanding maybe, or recognition of shared pain. "I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you." "I'm sorry for yours too." His eyebrows rose slightly. "News travels in small towns." "It does." They stood there in the morning light, 2 people marked by grief, measuring each other. Clara had no idea what he was thinking, but she felt suddenly that this moment mattered more than she could articulate. It wasn't just about a job. It was about whether she could start over, whether there was room in the world for her particular brand of broken. Finally, Grant nodded, as if making a decision. "The job is mostly administrative, like you said. Managing the books, coordinating with suppliers, scheduling the hands, keeping track of inventory. The pay is 40,000 a year, plus room and board in the guest house. He gestured toward a smaller log cabin about 100 yards from the main house. It's not big, but it's comfortable. Has its own kitchen, bathroom, fireplace. Plenty of room for you and whiskey. Clara's heart lurched. You're offering me the job? You want it? Yes, I do. Then it's yours. You can move in today if you'd like. I'll have Miguel. He's my foreman. Show you around later, introduce you to the hands. We can go over the books this afternoon, get you oriented. He paused, his expression serious again. This is hard work, Mrs. Whitmore. Long hours, especially during calving season and roundup. I expect people to pull their weight. I will, I promise. He studied her for another long moment, then nodded. Call me Grant. We don't stand on formality much around here. Clara. All right then, Clara. Welcome to the Delaney Ranch. He bent down and gave Whiskey one more scratch behind the ears. You too, Whiskey. Clara watched as Grant picked up his bucket and headed back toward the barn, moving with that same easy confidence. She stood there alone in the driveway, Whiskey pulling on his leash, and felt something crack open in her chest. Relief, maybe, or hope. Or just the simple understanding that she'd been offered a second chance when she'd been sure there were no more chances left. By noon, she checked out of the motel, driven back to the ranch, and carried her single suitcase into the guest house. Grant had been right, it wasn't big. One large room that served as living area and bedroom, a compact kitchen with old but functional appliances, a bathroom with a clawfoot tub, and a river rock fireplace that took up most of one wall. But it was clean and warm, and the view from the front window looked out over the meadow toward the mountains. It was more than she'd had any right to hope for. She unpacked, slowly, hanging her few clothes in the small closet, arranging her toiletries in the bathroom, setting Tom's photo on the nightstand. Her wedding ring caught the afternoon light as she worked, the gold band a quiet presence on her hand. As the sun began to set, Clara stood at the window and watched smoke rise from the chimney of Grant's house. She thought about his smile when he'd picked up Whiskey, about the gentleness in his hands, about the way he'd offered her a place without making her beg for it. Maybe, just maybe, she was going to be all right. Clara's first week on the ranch passed in a blur of learning and adjustment. Grant had given her a desk in the ranch, office, a converted storage room in one of the barns, where filing cabinets lined the walls and a computer from the early 2000s hummed and whirred with every keystroke. The system was chaotic but functional, the kind of setup that evolved organically over years rather than through any intentional design. She spent her days untangling spreadsheets, organizing receipts, and learning the rhythms of ranch operations. There were hay deliveries to schedule, veterinary appointments to coordinate, equipment maintenance to track, and payroll to manage for a dozen ranch hands who worked varying hours depending on the season. It was overwhelming at first, but Clara had always been good at finding order in chaos. And by Thursday, she'd already implemented a new filing system that made Grant raise his eyebrows in approval. The ranch hands were respectful but curious. They were a mix of ages and backgrounds. Miguel, the foreman, was in his 50s, a compact man with kind eyes who'd worked for the Delaneys since he was 19. The younger hands, mostly men in their 20s and 30s, treated her with polite deference, calling her ma'am and tipping their hats when they passed. She caught them watching her sometimes, clearly wondering about the widow who'd appeared out of nowhere and been given a place in their established world. Grant himself remained something of an enigma. He was courteous and professional, checking in with her each morning to review the day's priorities and each evening to see if she had questions. But their interactions rarely extended beyond work. He maintained a careful distance, and Clara found herself unsure how to bridge it, or if she should even try. The one exception was Whiskey. The dog had taken to ranch life with uncomplicated enthusiasm, and Grant seemed unable to resist him. Clara would look up from her computer to find Grant crouching beside Whiskey's bed in the corner of the office, scratching the dog's belly and murmuring things she couldn't quite hear. He brought Whiskey treats, biscuits from the feed store, scraps from his own meals, and often took him along when he went to check on the cattle or repair fences. Clara watched these interactions with something close to tenderness. There was a gentleness in Grant when he was with the dog, a softness that suggested deeper wells of emotion beneath his reserved exterior. It gave her hope that the distance between them wasn't permanent, just protective. On Friday evening, after the hands had gone home and the office had grown quiet, Clara was packing up for the day when she noticed a box she hadn't seen before, tucked under her desk. She pulled it out, confused. She didn't remember storing anything there. Inside were books. Tom's books. Her breath caught. She'd packed these in the car, meaning to donate them to the library in Pinewood, but in the chaos of moving into the guest house, she must have carried the box inside without thinking. Now here they were, a half-dozen worn paperbacks that Tom had read and reread. His favorite novels and poetry collections. Beneath the books was something else, a leather journal. Brown and battered, the cover soft with age. Clara lifted it out carefully, her hands trembling. She knew this journal. She'd given it to Tom 5 years ago, a Christmas gift he'd treasured. She'd thought it was lost, left behind in one of the moves or donated with so many other possessions. But here it was, the leather warm under her fingers, and when she opened it, she saw Tom's handwriting, neat and measured, filling page after page. She closed it immediately, suddenly afraid. She carried the box back to the guest house, whiskey trotting beside her, and set it on the small kitchen table. She made herself dinner, scrambled eggs and toast, and tried not to look at the journal. But it sat there like a living presence, demanding attention. After she'd eaten and washed the dishes, after she'd taken whiskey for a walk around the property and come back to find the guest house empty and quiet, she finally opened the journal again. The first entry was dated January 3rd, 5 years ago. Tom's handwriting was stronger then, before the illness had weakened his hands. Started this journal at Clara's insistence. She thinks I should write more, capture my thoughts. I told her my thoughts are mostly about whether the furnace needs replacing and what we're having for dinner. But she said that counts. So here we are, January in Tacoma. Rain, always rain. But Clara made pot roast tonight and we sat by the fire and read, and I thought, this is what happiness looks like. This quiet, ordinary evening. This woman across from me, reading glasses sliding down her nose. This life we built together. Clara's vision blurred. She turned the page, then another, skimming through entries about their daily life, mundane observations mixed with moments of reflection, Tom's steady love apparent in every line. She should have stopped, should have closed the journal and saved it for another day when she felt stronger. But she kept reading, drawn forward by the sound of his voice in her mind. She found the entries from when he got sick, his handwriting growing shakier, his thoughts turning darker, then finding light again, and then 6 months before he died, she found this. Talk to Dr. Morrison today. The treatment isn't working. We both knew, but hearing him say it out loud made it real. I cried in the car before driving home. Not for me, I've made my peace. But for Clara, she shouldn't have to lose me. She shouldn't have to face what comes next alone. I need to make sure she knows it's okay to let go. Not just of me, but of the life we had. Don't let my death become your prison, my love. Don't spend the rest of your years living in the past. You're 60 years old when I write this. You could have 20, 30 more good years ahead of you. Find joy in them. Find purpose. And if you find someone else to share them with, know that I am glad. You were never meant to be alone. Clara sat at the kitchen table and cried, the journal open in front of her, whiskey pressing against her legs in concern. Tom had known. He'd known she would struggle, would cling to his memory like a life raft. And he'd tried, even then, to give her permission to move forward. She cried for Tom, for the life they'd shared and lost. But she also cried for herself, for the weight she'd been carrying, the guilt that had crept in these past weeks as she found herself settling into life at the ranch, as she found herself drawn to Grant's quiet presence. As she realized, she was beginning to feel something other than grief. The knock at her door startled her. She wiped her eyes quickly and stood trying to compose herself. But when she opened the door and found Grant standing on her small porch, She knew immediately that her face betrayed her. "I saw your light on," he said, his expression uncertain. "Wanted to check that everything was all right with the guest house. But I can come back." "No, it's fine." "I'm fine," she attempted a smile. It's been a long week." He studied her with those steady eyes, seeing too much. "I was about to make dinner. Nothing fancy, just steak and potatoes. Thought you might want to join me rather than eating alone. But if you'd prefer, I'd like that." The words came out before she could second-guess them. "Give me 5 minutes to clean up." "Take your time. I'll be in the main house." He left, and Clara hurried to the bathroom to wash her face and run a brush through her hair. She looked tired, her eyes red from crying, but there was nothing to be done about that now. She put the journal carefully back in the box, then clipped Whiskey's leash on. The walk to Grant's house felt significant somehow, though she couldn't say why. Maybe it was the first time she'd been invited into his space. Or maybe it was Tom's words, still echoing in her mind. Either way, when Grant opened the door and smiled at Whiskey, that same warm, unguarded smile, Clara felt something shift inside her chest. The interior of the house was what she'd expected, comfortable without being showy, furniture built to last, everything neat and orderly. But what caught her attention was the mantel over the stone fireplace. Photographs lined it, silver frames holding captured moments. She could see a younger Grant with an older couple, who had to be his parents. Another photo showed 2 boys, teenagers, standing with their arms around each other. Grant and his brother, she guessed. The most recent photo showed just the 2 adult brothers, taken perhaps 7 or 8 years ago, both of them smiling in front of the barn. There were no photos of women, no wedding pictures, no hints of romance. Just family and loss and the weight of living alone. Grant followed her gaze. "That's my brother, Michael." The photo was taken about a year before he died. "You look alike." Everyone said that. He was better looking, though. Grant said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity. "Come on, dinner's ready." They ate at the kitchen table, and the meal was simple but good. Steak cooked medium rare, roasted potatoes with rosemary, green beans from the garden. Grant was a better cook than she'd expected, and she told him so. "Living alone, you either learn to cook or you starve," he said. "I got tired of frozen dinners pretty fast." They talked about safe things. The weather, the upcoming cattle auction, Clara's progress organizing the office. But beneath the mundane conversation, Clara felt something else, a tentative connection, fragile but real. Grant seemed more relaxed here in his own space, and she found herself relaxing too, the tension of the week easing from her shoulders. After dinner, as she helped him clear the dishes, Grant said quietly, "You seemed upset earlier. I don't mean to pry, but if there's something wrong with the job or the guest house—" "No, nothing like that. Everything here has been more than I hoped for." She hesitated, then decided to trust him with the truth. "I found something of my husband's tonight. A journal he kept. Reading his words again after all these months, it brought everything back." Grant nodded slowly. "I know that feeling. Finding things that belong to someone who's gone. It's like losing them all over again." "Yes." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the same grief she carried reflected in his face. They understood each other in a way that needed no explanation. "Thank you for dinner, Grant, and for the job. For all of it." "You're welcome." He walked her to the door, whiskey padding between them. "Clara, I'm glad you're here." The words were simple, but they settled into her heart, like stones in still water, creating ripples that spread outward into the night. October deepened around them, the days growing shorter and cooler, the aspens dropping their golden leaves until the branches stood bare against the sky. Clara had been at the ranch for 3 weeks now, and the work had settled into a comfortable rhythm. She knew the suppliers by name, understood the seasonal flow of ranch operations, and had even begun offering suggestions that Grant accepted with gratifying seriousness. But it was the small, unplanned moments that mattered most, somewhere around the end of the 2nd week. Without either of them formally deciding it, they'd started meeting for coffee on Grant's front porch each morning. Clara would emerge from the guest house just after sunrise, whiskey trotting beside her, and Grant would be waiting with 2 mugs and a thermos. They'd sit in the wooden rocking chairs his father had made, watching the light spread across the valley, talking about nothing and everything. These conversations felt different from their work discussions. Here, in the quiet of early morning, they began to share pieces of themselves they'd kept hidden. Grant spoke about growing up on the ranch, about his father's stern expectations and his mother's gentle humor. He talked about Michael, always Michael, never Mike. And Clara began to understand the shape of his grief. "We were going to run the ranch together," Grant said one morning, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug. "That was always the plan. Dad left it to both of us, equal shares. Michael was better with the animals than I was. He had this way of calming a spooked horse or a sick calf. I'm more practical, better with numbers and planning. We balanced each other. What happened?" Clara asked gently. Grant was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains. "Riding accident in the back pasture. His horse stepped in a prairie dog hole, went down hard. Michael hit his head on a rock. Miguel found him 3 hours later, but by then he stopped, swallowed hard. He was only 46, had his whole life ahead of him. I'm so sorry. I kept everything exactly as he left it. His saddle in the barn, his room in the house, his tools on the workbench. I thought if I changed anything, I'd be admitting he was really gone." He glanced at her. "Does that sound crazy?" "No, it sounds like love." He nodded, seemed to breathe a little easier. "What about you? You don't talk much about your husband." Clara took a sip of coffee, gathering her thoughts. "Tom was kind. That's the first word that comes to mind. He was steady and dependable, the sort of man who fixed things and remembered birthdays, and never once made me feel like I'd made a mistake in marrying him." She smiled at the memory. "The cancer took 1.5 years to kill him. Toward the end, I was so tired I could barely think straight. Working full-time, taking care of him, trying to stay positive when we both knew how it would end. That's a heavy burden. The worst part was watching him slip away piece by piece. By the last month, he wasn't really Tom anymore. Just a body in a bed in pain, confused. I'd sit with him and hold his hand and wish." She stopped, surprised by the tears in her eyes. "I wished he'd just let go. And then, when he finally did, I felt so guilty for wishing it." Grant reached over and took her hand. The gesture was simple, natural, and it made her breath catch. "You loved him enough to let him go when holding on would have been easier. That's not something to feel guilty about." They sat there in the dawn light, hands linked, and Clara felt something in her chest unfold. Not forgetting Tom, she'd never forget Tom, but making room for something new. 2 days later, Whiskey got sick. Clara found him in the morning, listless and refusing food, his nose dry and hot. She called the vet immediately, panic rising in her throat. Losing Whiskey felt unthinkable. He was her last connection to Tom, the living reminder of his final gift. Grant drove them to the clinic in town, his truck eating up the miles, while Clara held Whiskey in her lap and tried not to cry. The vet diagnosed a mild infection, prescribed antibiotics, and assured them the dog would be fine in a few days. That night, Grant appeared at the guest house with supplies, soft food for Whiskey, a heating pad, chicken broth. He sat with Clara on the floor beside the dog's bed, monitoring his temperature and making sure he drank water. They stayed up until past midnight, talking in low voices so as not to disturb Whiskey's rest. "You didn't have to do this," Clara said at one point. "Yes, I did." Grant scratched behind Whiskey's ears, his touch gentle. "He's family now," the word hung between them, full of meaning. By the weekend, Whiskey was back to his energetic self, and Clara had noticed something had shifted between her and Grant. The careful distance had eroded, replaced by an ease that felt both natural and terrifying. She caught him watching her sometimes, his expression unguarded, and she knew her own face must show the same thing. The town noticed too. Doris showed up at the ranch on Saturday afternoon, ostensibly to drop off a pie, but really Clara suspected to investigate. Clara invited her in for coffee, and they sat at the small kitchen table while Whiskey begged shamelessly for pie crumbs. "So," Doris said, her eyes twinkling with frank curiosity, "you and Grant seem to be settling in well. The work is going smoothly." "Honey, I'm not asking about the work." Doris leaned forward. "The whole town's talking about how Grant Delaney's had a widow, staying at his ranch, and how he smiles now when he comes into town, and how folks have seen you two having coffee together every morning. Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. I'm not here to judge. Lord knows both of you deserve some happiness after what you've been through. Doris's expression softened. But small towns talk, and I wanted you to hear it from a friend rather than someone less kind. People are curious.
Some are hopeful.
A few are jealous. That's just how it is. There's nothing romantic happening, Clara said, though the words felt like a lie, even as she spoke them. We're both still grieving our losses. It's too soon, is it? Doris asked gently. Or is that just what we tell ourselves when we're scared? The question stayed with Clara long after Doris left. On Sunday, Grant asked if she'd like to ride out with him to check the fences in the upper pasture. Clara hadn't been on a horse in decades, not since her teenage years, but she agreed immediately. Grant saddled a gentle mare named Daisy, patiently, helped Clara mount, and led the way up into the foothills. The October afternoon was crisp and clear, the sky that impossible blue that only comes in autumn. They rode slowly, Grant occasionally pointing out landmarks or wildlife. Clara was stiff at first, unused to the rhythm of the horse, but gradually she relaxed and found herself enjoying the simple pleasure of movement and sun and companionship. In the upper pasture, Grant dismounted to inspect a section of fence that had come loose. While he worked, Clara sat on Daisy and watched him. The competent way he handled the tools, the strength in his shoulders, the concentration in his face. He was a good man, she thought, solid and reliable, wounded but healing, the kind of man who showed up when you needed him, the kind of man she could love, if she let herself. When Grant finished the repair, he didn't remount immediately. Instead, he walked over to stand beside Daisy, looking up at Clara with something uncertain in his expression. There's a ridge about a mile from here, he said. Beautiful view of the valley, worth the ride if you're not too tired. I'd like that. They rode side by side to the ridge, and the view was every bit as spectacular as Grant had promised. The Beat Valley spread below them, the town of Pinewood just visible in the distance, the river winding like a silver thread through the meadows. The mountains rose all around, eternal and indifferent, and Clara felt suddenly very small and very grateful to be exactly where she was. Grant dismounted and helped her down, his hands firm on her waist. He didn't step back immediately, and neither did she. They stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. Clara, he said quietly, yes, I'm glad you're here. I need you to know that. The words echoed what he'd said after their first dinner. Together, but this time they carried a different weight. This time, she understood that he wasn't just talking about the ranch or the work or the convenience of having help. I'm glad I'm here too, she whispered. They stood there for a long moment, the sun beginning its descent toward the western peaks. The horses grazing nearby, the world holding its breath. Grant's hand came up to touch her face, just the lightest brush of his fingers against her cheek, and Clara's eyes closed at the tenderness of it. They didn't kiss. The moment felt too fragile for that, too new, but something had been acknowledged. Some door had been opened that neither of them could close again. On the ride back to the ranch, Clara's heart was pounding. That night, alone in the guest house with whiskey curled at her feet, she finally admitted the truth she'd been avoiding for days. She was falling for Grant Delaney, and the realization terrified her more than anything had in a very long time. The first snow came on the 3rd of November, soft and silent in the night, dusting the ranch with white by morning. Clara woke to a transformed world, everything crystalline and new, and felt an unexpected surge of joy. She'd forgotten how beautiful Montana winters could be, how the snow softened the harsh edges of the landscape and made everything feel clean and possible. She'd been at the ranch for 6 weeks now. 6 weeks of learning and settling and gradually, carefully, allowing herself to build something that felt like a life rather than just survival. The office was organized, the accounts were in order. And she'd even implemented a new digital system that had Grant shaking his head in admiration. But more than that, she'd become part of the rhythm of the ranch, woven into its daily patterns in ways that felt natural and right. Still, there were moments when she'd catch herself laughing at something Grant said or looking forward to their morning coffee with an eagerness that had nothing to do with caffeine, and she'd feel a sharp pang of guilt. Was she betraying Tom's memory? Was she moving on too quickly? She'd been married for 35 years, and Tom had been dead for less than a year. What kind of woman fell for another man so soon? But then she'd remember Tom's words in the journal. Don't. Let my death become your prison. And the guilt would ease, replaced by confusion and fear and a tentative, fragile hope. One evening, while sorting through the last boxes from her old life, Clara found a photograph she hadn't seen in decades. It showed a young woman, maybe 18 or 19, standing in front of Pinewood High School with a genuine smile. She wore jeans and a flannel shirt, her dark hair long and loose, her whole face bright with the kind of optimism that comes before life teaches you about loss and compromise. Clara stared at that photograph for a long time, trying to recognize herself in that girl. What had she wanted back then? Where had she thought her life would lead? She'd left this town so sure she knew what she needed: education, culture, a bigger world. And she'd found those things. She'd built a good life, a meaningful life, but looking at the photograph now, she wondered if that girl would have believed that the best chapters might still be ahead, waiting in the place she'd been so eager to leave. The next morning, Grant appeared at her door with an invitation. "There's a community harvest dinner in town Saturday night," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "At the church. Everyone brings a dish. There's music, dancing. I usually skip it, but I thought if you wanted to go, we could go together." Clara's heart did something complicated in her chest. This felt significant, like crossing a line from private connection to public acknowledgement. "Are you sure? Won't people talk?" "People are already talking." He smiled wryly. "Doris has made sure of that. But if it bothers you, it doesn't bother me." She took a breath. "I'd like to go." Saturday evening, Clara stood in front of her tiny bathroom mirror and tried to decide what to wear to a church dinner that suddenly felt like the most important social event of her life. She settled on a simple burgundy sweater and dark slacks, her hair pulled back in a low bun, minimal makeup. She looked respectable, she thought, appropriate for a widow of a certain age. But when Grant knocked on her door and she saw the way, his eyes widened. The way his gaze traveled over her with undisguised appreciation. She felt beautiful for the first time in longer than she could remember. "You look—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "You look very nice." "So do you." He'd clearly made an effort. Clean jeans, a white button-down shirt, a leather jacket that made his shoulders look even broader. He'd shaved carefully, and his hair was still damp from the shower. They were both trying, she realized, both nervous about what this evening might mean. The drive into town was quiet, but it was the comfortable silence of two people who'd learned they didn't need to fill every moment with words. Clara watched. The snow-dusted landscape passed by, feeling Grant's presence beside her like a warm current in the cold night. The church was already packed when they arrived, the parking lot full of trucks, light and laughter spilling from the windows. Grant came around to open her door, offered his hand to help her down, and kept holding it as they walked toward the entrance. The moment they stepped through the door, Clara felt every eye in the room turn toward them. The community room was decorated with autumn colors, orange and gold streamers, centerpieces made of pumpkins and gourds. Long tables groaned under the weight of potluck dishes, and a small band was setting up in the corner. Probably 80 or 90 people filled the space, and Clara recognized some faces from her youth, now older and weathered but still familiar. Doris appeared immediately, beaming. "There you are! I was hoping you'd come. Clara, you look lovely. Grant, you clean up pretty well yourself." She winked at them both. "Come on, I'll introduce you around." Or reintroduce, I suppose, for Clara. The next hour passed in a blur of names and faces. Some people remembered Clara from before she left, though most didn't recognize her at first. She met ranchers and shop owners, teachers and retired farmers, all of them curious about the widow who'd come back and ended up at the Delaney ranch. Most were kind, their questions gentle and well-meaning. A few were less subtle, their interest shading into nosiness. Helen Morrison was in the latter category. She'd been Helen Brandt back in high school, 3 years ahead of Clara, and even then she'd been known for knowing everyone's business. Now she descended on Clara with the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Clara Whitmore," she said, as if tasting the name. "I heard you were back. You married Tom. What was his last name? Williams?" "No, Whitmore, same as your maiden name. How convenient." She glanced at Grant, who had remained at Clara's side throughout the evening. "And now you're working for Grant. Also convenient." Clara felt Grant tense beside her. "It's nice to see you again, Helen. Are you still teaching at the elementary school?" "Retired 2 years ago." Helen's gaze was sharp. "You know, it's funny. You left Pinewood saying you'd never come back, that this place was too small for your ambitions. And here you are, 40 years later, working as a ranch secretary. Life has interesting ways of humbling us, doesn't it?" The words stung more than Clara wanted to admit. But before she could respond, Grant stepped forward slightly. His voice pleasant, but his eyes hard. "Clara's not a secretary. Helen, she's the ranch manager, and she's doing work that would take most people years to master. We're lucky to have her." He took Clara's elbow gently. "If you'll excuse us, I think they're about to start serving." He guided Clara away, and she felt a rush of gratitude mixed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I should have handled that better. Helen Morrison has been a bitter woman for as long as I've known her. Don't let her get to you." He looked down at her, his expression softening. "You're not her words, Clara. You're not anyone's judgment but your own." After dinner, when the band started playing, a local group that knew every country standard ever written, couples began moving to the small dance floor. Clara watched from their table, content to observe, when Grant stood and extended his hand. "Dance with me." Her stomach fluttered. "I haven't danced in years. I've probably forgotten how." "I doubt that. And even if you have, we'll figure it out together." She took his hand on the dance floor. Grant pulled her close, one hand at her waist and the other holding hers. And they began to move to a slow ballad about lost love and second chances. Clara was stiff at first, hyper-aware of every eye still watching them. But gradually, the music and Grant's steady presence eased her tension. He was a good dancer, confident and sure, leading her gently through the turns. She let herself relax against him, her head nearly resting on his shoulder, breathing in the scent of his aftershave and the clean soap smell of his shirt. This close, she could feel the solid strength of him, the warmth of his body against hers. "People are definitely talking now," she whispered. "Let them." His hand tightened slightly at her waist. "I don't care what they say. You should. You live here. This is your community. So do you now. And anyone who has a problem with us being friends, or more than friends, isn't someone whose opinion matters to me." The words, "more than friends," hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. Clara looked up at him, met his eyes, and saw the same uncertainty and desire she felt reflected back at her. The song ended, but they didn't immediately step apart. They stood there, still holding each other, until the band started a faster number and the spell broke. On the drive home, the truck's cab felt smaller, charged with an energy that hadn't been there before. Clara sat with her hands in her lap, acutely aware of Grant just inches away, of the way his hands looked on the steering wheel, of the slight tension in his jaw. At one point he shifted gears, and his hand came to rest on the console between them. Without thinking, Clara moved her own hand closer, her fingers nearly touching his. Neither of them completed the connection, but the almost touch was electric, full of all the things they hadn't said. When they pulled up to the ranch, Grant walked her to the guest house door, whiskey bounding around their feet. They stood on the small porch, the night cold and clear, stars scattered across the sky like salt. "Thank you for tonight," Clara said. For taking me, for defending me, for everything. You don't have to thank me." Grant's voice was rough. "Clara, He stopped, seemed to struggle with something. She waited, her heart hammering. "I think about you," he finally said. "More than I probably should. More than I've thought about anyone in a very long time. And I don't know what to do with that. I don't know if I'm ready, or if you're ready, or if we're both just scared." Clara finished softly, terrified. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I lost my brother, and it nearly destroyed me. The thought of caring about someone that much again, of risking that kind of pain." "I know." She reached out, touched his arm. "I lost Tom, and I swore I'd never let myself be that vulnerable again. Never give anyone that much power to hurt me." They looked at each other, two people standing on the edge of something that felt both inevitable and impossible. "But you're here," Grant said, "and I'm here. And every morning I wake up looking forward to seeing you, and every night I go to bed thinking about you. So I guess what I'm saying is, I don't know what happens next, but I'd like to find out. If you want that too." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I do, God help me, I do. But I'm so afraid, Grant." "Me too." He touched her face, his fingers gentle against her cheek. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe being afraid just means it matters." He left before she could respond, walking back to the main house with his hands in his pockets. And Clara stood on her porch for a long time, watching his silhouette against the lit windows, her heart full of equal parts hope and terror. Mid-November brought colder mornings and an early dusk that painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. Ranch work had begun to slow, the rhythm changing as winter approached. The cattle had been brought down from the high pastures. Preparations were underway for the lean months ahead, and the crew's hours had shortened with the daylight. Clara had noticed Grant visiting the small family cemetery behind the main house more frequently. She discovered it during her second week, a quiet spot surrounded by a white picket fence where 3 generations of Delaneys rested beneath simple headstones. His parents, his grandparents, and there, under a young aspen tree, Michael Grant Delaney, beloved son and brother. She'd seen Grant there several times now, always alone, always still, standing before his brother's grave with his hat in his hands. She never intruded on those moments, understanding they were private and sacred. But today, when she saw him walk that path in the early morning cold, she found herself filling a thermos with hot coffee and following. He heard her approach, but didn't turn. She came to stand beside him, offering the thermos without words. He took it, poured coffee into the cup that served as a cap, and handed it back to her. Then he poured some for himself, and they stood together in comfortable silence, the steam rising between them. "I come here when I need to think," Grant said eventually, "or when I need to remember who I was before everything changed." "What do you tell him?" "Mostly that I'm trying to keep the ranch going, trying to honor what he loved about this place." He paused. "Lately I've been telling him about you." Clara's heart skipped. "What do you tell him about me?" "That you make me laugh, that you're smart and kind and stronger than you give yourself credit for, that you've helped me remember what it feels like to look forward instead of backward." He glanced at her, his expression vulnerable. "That I think he'd like you. I wish I could have known him. He would have loved you." Michael was good at seeing people clearly, at understanding what they needed. He'd have seen right through your walls to the heart underneath. They drank their coffee as the sun climbed higher, turning the frost-covered grass to diamonds. Clara thought about how grief shaped people, how it carved out spaces that never quite filled again, but could, with time, become something other than hollow pain. "Can I ask you something?" she said carefully. "That day in the barn you said you've kept everything exactly as Michael left it. Does that help? Does it make you feel closer to him?" Grant was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was raw. "At first, yes. Walking into his room and seeing his jacket on the chair, his boots by the door, it made me feel like he'd just stepped out for a minute, like he might come back any time. But now," he stopped, swallowed hard. "Now I think I'm just afraid that if I change anything, I'll lose him completely. Like he'll disappear if I don't keep everything frozen. Honoring someone doesn't mean freezing time," Clara said gently. "Tom's been gone 9 months now, and I kept his shirts hanging in our closet for 8 of those months. I couldn't bear to touch them. But finally, I donated them to a shelter, and you know what? It didn't make me forget him. It didn't erase what we had. It just made room for me to remember him without the grief choking me. Grant looked at her, something shifting in his expression. How did you know when you were ready? I'm not sure I did know. I just realized one day that I was holding on to objects instead of memories, and that Tom wouldn't have wanted that. He'd have wanted those shirts to keep someone warm. He'd have wanted me to live in the present rather than a museum of the past. They stood there in the cold morning, two people learning how to let go without forgetting, how to move forward while still honoring what they'd lost. Would you help me? Grant asked suddenly. With Michael's things. I don't think I can do it alone. Of course, that afternoon they met in the barn, where Michael's saddle still hung on the wall, exactly where it had been the day he died. The leather was dusty now, unused for 5 years, but it had been beautiful once, custom-made, intricately tooled, a saddle that spoke to a man's love for his work and his animals. Grant lifted it down with careful hands, and Clara saw his eyes were wet. She touched his shoulder, offering silent support as he ran his fingers over the leather, tracing patterns he'd probably memorized years ago. He saved for 2 years to buy this, Grant said quietly. Had it made by a craftsman in Bozeman. He was so proud of it. Around them, the barn held other remnants of Michael's presence. Tools arranged on a workbench, a jacket hanging on a hook, photographs pinned to a bulletin board showing a younger Grant and Michael working together, laughing together, building the life they'd planned to share. For the next 3 hours, they sorted through it all. Clara asked gentle questions, listened to stories, learned about the man who'd shaped Grant's life in ways both visible and invisible. Some things they packed carefully to keep, photographs, a pocket watch that had belonged to their father, a hand-carved wooden horse Michael had made as a teenager that showed real artistry and care. Other things they decided to pass on. The tools would go to the ranch hands who could use them. The clothes would be donated. And the saddle, there's a youth riding program in town, Grant said, his voice thick with emotion. Michael volunteered with them every summer, teaching kids who couldn't afford their own equipment. He loved those kids, loved seeing them light up when they mastered something new. They could use a good saddle. This saddle deserves to be used, not gathering dust. Clara heard the shift in his words, from holding on to letting go, from past tense to present purpose. She watched as he called the program director, explained what he wanted to donate, listened to the woman's gratitude and her memories of Michael's kindness. When he hung up, he looked lighter somehow, as if he'd set down a weight he'd been carrying too long. Thank you, he said, pulling Clara into a hug that surprised them both. I couldn't have done this without you. She held him, feeling the solid strength of him, the vulnerability of this moment. Yes, you could have. You just needed someone to walk beside you. When they finally left the barn, the sun was setting in shades of purple and gold. Grant turned to her at the door. Come to dinner tonight. Not at your place or the kitchen table, but a real dinner. I want to cook for you properly. I'd like that. That evening, Clara showered and changed, nerves fluttering in her stomach like trapped birds. Something had shifted between them today, something significant. The walls Grant had maintained were crumbling, and she felt her own defenses weakening in response. When she knocked on Grant's door, he answered wearing an apron over his button-down shirt, his sleeves rolled up, a smile on his face that made her heart stutter. Come in. I hope you like pot roast. It's about the only thing I know how to make that's impressive. The house smelled amazing, rich and savory. And the table was set with care, cloth napkins, candles, the good china that probably hadn't been used in years. Grant had gone to effort, and Clara felt touched by the gesture. Over dinner, they talked about everything and nothing, childhood memories, favorite books. Silly arguments about whether coffee should be drunk black or with cream. But beneath the easy conversation ran a current of awareness, an electric tension that built with every glance, every accidental brush of hands reaching for the salt. After the dishes were cleared, Grant built a fire in the living room fireplace, and they settled onto the leather couch with glasses of wine. Whiskey had curled up on the rug, content and drowsy. his presence a comfortable reminder that life contained simple pleasures alongside complicated emotions. "Today was hard," Grant said, staring into the flames. "But it was good too, necessary. I've been stuck for so long, Clara, living but not really alive. Just going through motions and telling myself it was enough. I know that feeling, but you're not stuck anymore, are you? You came here with nothing, started over, rebuilt your life. That takes courage. I didn't feel courageous. I felt desperate and scared. Sometimes those are the same thing." He turned to face her, his expression open in a way she'd never seen before. "I haven't felt this way since before Michael died. Haven't wanted to feel this way. But you—" He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "You make me want to try again. To risk caring about someone, to believe that good things might still be possible." Clara's breath caught. "Grant, I know it's fast. I know we're both carrying grief. But I can't pretend anymore that I don't feel what I feel. I think about you constantly. Wonder what you're doing, what you're thinking. I find excuses to see you, to talk to you. And when I'm with you, I feel like myself again. The person I was before loss taught me to be careful." Tears pricked Clara's eyes. "I'm scared. I'm so scared of this, of losing someone else I care about. But I can't seem to stop myself from falling." She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Grant leaned forward, his free hand coming up to cup her face, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. "We don't have to rush," he said softly. "We don't have to figure everything out tonight. But I need you to know that I'm here, that I see you, that He stopped, as if the next words were too enormous to speak aloud. But Clara saw them in his eyes, felt them in the gentleness of his touch. "I don't want to run," she whispered. "I want to stay. I want this, whatever this becomes." Grant's eyes closed briefly, relief washing over his face. When he opened them again, he was so close she could count his eyelashes, could see every line that grief and work had carved into his features. "Can I kiss you?" His voice was barely audible. Yes, he kissed her with a tenderness that made her chest ache. His lips were soft against hers, questioning rather than demanding, and Clara responded with her whole heart, her hand coming up to rest against his chest, where she could feel his heart racing to match her own. The kiss deepened slowly, carefully, two people learning each other, discovering how their mouths fit together, how it felt to be this close to someone again. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Grant rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," he admitted. "I'm glad you finally did." They sat there by the fire, wrapped in each other's arms, while whiskey snored softly and the logs crackled and popped. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent, covering the world in white. And inside, two damaged hearts began, tentatively to heal. Late November arrived with deeper cold and shorter days, but Clara barely noticed. The past 2 weeks had felt like living in a dream, a good dream, the kind you wake from reluctant and wishing for just a few more minutes. She and Grant hadn't put a label on what they were to each other. They hadn't needed to. The relationship had simply grown, quiet and steady, like roots spreading beneath winter soil. They spent their mornings together over coffee, their days working side by side, their evenings sharing meals and conversation. He'd kissed her goodnight every evening since that first kiss by the fire. Tender kisses that promised more, but never pushed, both of them content to let things unfold naturally. Clara had stopped wearing her wedding ring on her left hand 2 days ago. She'd moved it to her right hand instead, a private acknowledgement that while she'd never forget Tom, she was ready to step fully into her present. Grant had noticed immediately, had taken her hand and pressed a kiss to that bare ring finger, and the gesture had made her cry. She was happy. She was healing. She was allowing herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved this second chance at love, which was why the letter felt like a bomb going off in the middle of her carefully reconstructed life. It arrived on a Monday morning, delivered by the regular mail carrier who handed it to Clara with a friendly nod. The envelope was official-looking, embossed with the logo of Metropolitan Life Insurance, addressed to Mrs. Clara Whitmore. She carried it back to the office, her hands already trembling with an unease she couldn't name. She opened it standing by her desk, whiskey at her feet, sensing her tension. The letter was formal, written in the bland corporate language of legal documents, but its content hit her like a physical blow. Dear Mrs. Whitmore, we are writing to inform you that you are the named beneficiary of a life insurance policy held by your late husband, Thomas James Whitmore, through his former employer, Pacific Northwest Engineering. This policy, rate 847291, was maintained as part of Mr. Whitmore's retirement benefits package. Following our review of the claim submitted on your behalf by the estate executor, we are pleased to confirm that you are eligible to receive the full death benefit of $250,000. After taxes and processing fees, the net amount payable to you is $198,450. Please find and close the necessary claim forms. Clara had to sit down. Her legs simply stopped working, and she sank into her desk chair, the letter trembling in her hands. She read it again, then a third time. The numbers didn't change. Nearly $200,000. Tom had life insurance. Life insurance she'd known nothing about, buried in paperwork from a job he'd retired from 7 years ago. The estate executor, the lawyer who'd helped her navigate Tom's debts after he died, had apparently found it while doing a final sweep of his employment records. She vaguely remembered signing forms the lawyer had sent, but she'd been so numb with grief and exhaustion that she hadn't processed what they meant. She'd spent the last 4 months believing she was broke, believed she had nothing, that she needed this job to survive, that coming to Montana was her only option. But now she could pay off every cent of debt. She could start over anywhere she wanted. She could go back to Tacoma, rent an apartment, take time to figure out what she really wanted from life. She didn't need Grant's job. She didn't need Grant's guest house. She didn't need Grant. The thought made her stomach clench with something close to panic, because she wanted him. God, she wanted him. But was that the same as needing him? Had she fallen for him because he represented security and stability, because he'd offered her a life raft when she was drowning? Or had she fallen for him because of who he was? The man beneath the rancher, the person who made her laugh and held her when she cried and kissed her like she was precious. How could she know the difference? Clara sat at her desk for over an hour, the letter in her lap, her mind spinning in circles. Around her, the office felt suddenly foreign, temporary. The filing system she'd organized, the schedules she'd created, the routines she'd built, they were all contingent on her needing to be here, on her having nowhere else to go. But now she did have somewhere else to go. She had choices, she had freedom, and she had no idea what to do with any of it. When Grant came to the office at noon to discuss supply orders, he found her still sitting there, staring at nothing. He took one look at her face and crossed the room immediately. What's wrong? What happened? Clara handed him the letter without speaking. She watched his face as he read it, saw his expression shift from concern to comprehension to something she couldn't quite read. Maybe resignation, maybe hurt. He swallowed hard. That's wonderful news, Clara. You're free. You can pay off your debts, start fresh. Yes. The word came out flat and Grant's jaw tightened. He handed the letter back carefully, as if it might burn him. So you'll be leaving. It wasn't a question. I don't know. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. I need to think. Of course, his face had shuttered, become the same closed expression he'd worn when she first arrived. Take all the time you need. The job is yours as long as you want it, but if you decide to go... He stopped, seemed to struggle with something. I'll understand. He left before she could find words to respond. That night, Clara sat alone in the guest house, the letter on her table next to Tom's journal, and tried to untangle the knot of emotions in her chest. She felt relief, of course she did. The debt had been a crushing weight, and now it was gone. She felt grateful that Tom had provided for her even in death, that he'd thought ahead in ways she hadn't known about. But she also felt terrified, because this changed everything. It removed the practical reasons that had brought her here, left only the emotional ones. and emotions felt so much more dangerous than necessity. She'd told herself she was staying at the ranch because she needed the work, needed the room, needed the fresh start. But without those needs, what was left? Just her feelings for Grant, just the terrifying, vulnerable truth that she'd fallen in love with a man she'd known for less than 3 months. That she wanted to build a life with him, not because she had to, but because she chose to. What if he didn't feel the same way? What if he'd offered her the job out of pity, and the relationship had grown from proximity and loneliness rather than genuine connection? What if she stayed, and he realized he didn't actually want her, didn't want the complication of another person in his carefully controlled life? Clara opened Tom's journal with shaking hands, needing his wisdom, needing something to anchor her in this storm of uncertainty. She paged through entries she'd read before, looking for guidance, and found it in words she'd overlooked the first time. Clara asked me today what I'd want for her if I died first. I told her the truth. I'd want her to live fully, not just survive, not just go through motions, but really live. Find joy, find purpose. And if she finds love again, I'd want that for her too. She got upset, said she couldn't imagine loving anyone else. But I need her to know this. Love isn't a finite resource. Loving someone new doesn't diminish what we had. It doesn't make our 35 years together mean less. It just means her heart is big enough to hold more than one great love. I hope she remembers this. I hope she doesn't let fear or guilt or some misguided sense of loyalty keep her from happiness. Don't let my death become your prison, my love. Don't use my memory as an excuse to hide from life. If you're reading this after I'm gone, if you've met someone who makes you smile again, who makes you feel alive again, then for God's sake, Clara, don't run. Don't tell yourself you're betraying me or it's too soon, or you don't deserve it. You deserve every happiness. You deserve to be loved and to love in return. That's all I've ever wanted for you. Clara read those words through tears, her chest aching with the weight of them. Tom had known her so well, had understood exactly what she'd need to hear. And he was right. She was looking for excuses. She was using practicality as a shield against vulnerability, using the question of need versus want as a reason to doubt something that felt real and true and terrifying. She'd come to Montana out of necessity, but she'd fallen for Grant out of choice. And that choice was scarier than any debt, any uncertainty about the future, because it required her to be brave in a way she'd never had to be before. Tom had been her college sweetheart, the only man she'd ever loved, the safe and steady choice that had never asked her to risk very much. But Grant was different. He wasn't safe. He was wounded and complicated, and loving him meant choosing to be vulnerable, to risk her heart knowing it might break again. The question wasn't whether she needed to stay. The question was whether she was brave enough to choose to stay. Clara sat up late into the night, whiskey curled beside her, the journal open on her lap. She thought about the woman she'd been when she arrived here, desperate, grieving, convinced her best years were behind her. And she thought about who she'd become, stronger, happier, willing to believe that maybe life had more chapters left to write. Grant hadn't come to see her. He'd respected her need for space, but she knew he was hurting. She'd seen it in his face, in the careful way he'd handed back the letter, in the resignation in his voice when he said he'd understand if she left. He thought she was going to leave. He'd already started protecting himself, already started building back the walls she'd worked so hard to help him dismantle, and Clara had to decide, was she going to prove him right, or was she going to fight for what they'd built? Dawn found her still awake, exhausted but clear-eyed. She knew what she had to do. She knew what she wanted. The only question now was whether she'd have the courage to claim it, and whether Grant would still be willing to meet her halfway. 3 days passed in a fog of avoidance and misery. Clara went to the office, did her work with mechanical efficiency, and retreated to the guest house the moment her hours were finished. She skipped the morning coffee ritual, claiming a headache the first day, oversleeping the second, simply not showing up the third. She couldn't face Grant, couldn't look into those honest eyes and see the hurt and confusion she knew would be there. Grant gave her space, but she felt his presence like a weight in the air between them. She'd see him watching from the barn as she walked whiskey, or notice fresh firewood stacked by her door that she hadn't asked for. Small gestures that said he was still there, still caring, even as the distance between them grew. On the morning of December 1st, Clara was working at her desk when the office door opened and Grant walked in. His face was set in hard lines, his jaw tight, and there was something different in his eyes, not hurt now, but determination. "We need to talk," he said, closing the door behind him. Clara's stomach dropped. "Grant, I don't think—" "No, we're not doing this anymore. 3 days, Clara. 3 days you've been avoiding me like I did something wrong, and I deserve to know what I did. What changed between us?" "Nothing changed." "That's a lie." His voice was sharp, cutting. "Everything changed the moment you got that letter. So talk to me. Tell me what you're thinking." Clara stood, her hands shaking. She pulled the letter from her desk drawer where she'd been keeping it, as if hiding it away might make it less real. She held it out to him. "You already saw this. I saw it for 2 minutes. I saw enough to know you don't need this job anymore, don't need this place. But I don't understand why that means you need to shut me out, because I don't know what's real." The words burst out of her, raw and desperate. "I don't know if what I feel for you is genuine, or if it's just gratitude or dependence, or some kind of transference, because you saved me when I was drowning." Grant's eyes widened, then narrowed. "Saved you? I gave you a job, Clara, that's it. You saved yourself, but I needed you. Don't you see? I came here with nothing. You offered me work and a place to live, and I was so grateful, and then we got close, and I thought—" She stopped, tears welling in her eyes. "I thought I was falling in love with you. But now I have money. Now I have choices. And I don't know if my feelings will survive having options." The silence that followed was terrible. Grant stared at her like she'd struck him, his face going pale and then flushing with anger. "So that's what you think of me? Of us?" His voice was low and dangerous. "That you only wanted me because I was convenient? Because I was here and you were desperate?" "That's not what I meant." "That's exactly what you meant." He took a step back, and Clara felt the distance like a chasm opening between them. "You know what I think? I think you're looking for an excuse to run. I think you're scared and you'd rather sabotage this than risk getting hurt, so you're making up reasons to convince yourself it wasn't real. That's not fair, isn't it? You've been here almost 3 months, Clara. We've talked every day, shared our lives, shared our grief. I've opened up to you in ways I haven't with anyone in 5 years. I've let you in, let myself care about you, let myself hope for the first time since Michael died. And the moment you get a little financial security, the moment you don't absolutely need me anymore, you start looking for the exit." Clara felt anger rising to match his. "Maybe I am looking for an exit. Maybe I need to know I can survive without you before I commit to being with you. Did you ever think about that? Did you ever consider that I spent 35 years depending on Tom, and when he died, I was lost, and I don't want to repeat that pattern. I don't want to need you so much that I lose myself." "Nobody's asking you to lose yourself. I'm asking you to take a risk, to believe that what we have is worth fighting for, even when it's scary." Easy for you to say. You're not the one who had to rebuild your entire life from scratch. You're not the one who showed up here with nothing and got offered a job out of pity. Pity? Grant's voice rose. You think I hired you out of pity? I hired you because you were qualified and willing, and because I saw something in you that reminded me what it was like to give a damn about something other than just getting through the day. And he stopped, his hands clenching into fists. I fell for you because you're smart and strong and beautiful and kind, because you make me laugh and you challenge me and you see me, really see me, not just the ranch or the money or the tragedy. But apparently that doesn't matter. Apparently I was just convenient. You're twisting my words, am I? Because it sounds to me like you've already made up your mind. You're already halfway out the door, and you're just looking for permission to leave. The accusation hit too close to home, and Clara lashed out without thinking. Maybe you want me to leave. Maybe it's easier for you if I go, so you can go back to your safe, lonely life where you don't have to risk your heart. Maybe you're just as scared as I am, but you're too proud to admit it." Grant went very still. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut deeper than any shout. "If you believe that, then you don't know me at all." He turned and walked out. The door closing behind him, with a quiet click that felt like a gunshot, Clara stood alone in the office, her chest heaving, tears streaming down her face. Whiskey whined from his bed in the corner, and she collapsed into her chair, burying her face in her hands. She'd just destroyed the best thing to happen to her in years. She'd let fear and doubt poison something beautiful, and she'd hurt Grant in the process. Seen the pain in his eyes when she'd suggested he didn't really care about her. But even through the regret, she felt something else, a stubborn, irrational anger. Because part of what she'd said was true. She did need to know she could stand on her own. She did need to understand her feelings outside the context of dependence, without letting herself think too hard about it. Clara grabbed her coat and keys and drove into town. The diner was mostly empty on a Tuesday afternoon. Doris looked up from wiping down the counter and immediately set down her rag. "What happened?" How did you... Honey, you look like you've been crying for a week. Come sit. I'll get you coffee." Clara slid into a booth and let Doris fuss over her, bringing coffee and pie she didn't want, sitting across from her with the practiced ease of someone who'd counseled half the town through heartbreak at some point or another. "Tell me," Doris said simply. So Clara did. She told Doris about the insurance money, about her doubts, about the fight with Grant. The words poured out in a messy rush, and Doris listened without interrupting, her expression sympathetic but clear-eyed. When Clara finally ran out of words, Doris sat back and shook her head. "You know what your problem is? You're thinking too much. That's not helpful." "Sure it is. You're in your head, analyzing every feeling, questioning every motive, trying to logic your way through something that isn't logical. Love doesn't make sense, Clara. It's not a math equation you can solve. It's a leap of faith. But what if I'm wrong? What if? Doris reached across the table and took Clara's hand. "Let me tell you something. My first husband died when I was 53. Heart attack, no warning. I was devastated. Thought my life was over. 5 years later, I met Henry at a church social. He was kind and funny, and he made me feel alive again. And you know what I did? I ran. Told him I wasn't ready, that it was too soon, that I couldn't betray Jim's memory. I moved 2 states away to live near my daughter. What happened? I was miserable. Spent 6 months realizing I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. Finally called Henry, expecting him to tell me to go to hell. But he just said, 'Took you long enough.' We got married 3 months later. Been together 22 years now." Clara felt tears welling again. "I said terrible things to Grant. I accused him of not really caring, of just wanting someone convenient. Fear makes us say the stupidest things," Doris said firmly. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Clara didn't have an answer. She drove back to the ranch in a daze, her mind churning. When she got to the guest house, she opened her laptop on impulse and searched for flights from Billings to Seattle. There was one leaving Friday morning. Before she could second-guess herself, she booked it, entered her credit card information, clicked confirm. The email confirmation appeared in her inbox immediately. She stared at it, her heart hammering. She'd done it. She'd bought a ticket. She was leaving in 4 days. She printed the confirmation at the library in town. The guest house didn't have a printer, and brought it back to the ranch, setting it on her kitchen counter where she could see it. Physical proof of a decision, even if she wasn't sure it was the right one. Meanwhile, Grant was standing in the barn with Miguel, who'd noticed the tension and asked what was wrong. Grant found himself explaining the whole situation, the insurance money, Clara's doubts, the fight, while Miguel listened with the patience of someone who'd seen Grant through the worst years of his life. "So she's leaving," Miguel said when Grant finished. "Probably. And you're just going to let her go?" Grant's jaw tightened. "What am I supposed to do? She thinks she only wanted me because I was convenient. How do you fight that?" "By telling her she's wrong. By fighting for her even if she's scared." Miguel shook his head. "Boss, I've known you most of your life. I watched you shut down after Michael died, watched you go through the motions without really living. And then Clara showed up, and I watched you come back to life. You smile now. You laugh. You look forward to tomorrow instead of just surviving today. You think I'm going to stand here and watch you let that go without a fight? She doesn't want me to fight for her. She wants space to figure things out. That's the fear talking, not the woman. She's scared, so she's pushing you away. But that doesn't mean you give up. That doesn't mean you let pride stop you from telling her the truth. What if I tell her, and she leaves anyway? Then at least you tried. At least you gave her all the information before she made her choice. But if you stay silent, if you let her go without knowing how you really feel, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. Miguel's words echoed in Grant's head long after their conversation ended. He thought about Clara, about the way she'd looked that morning, scared and defensive, but also hurting. He thought about the accusations they'd thrown at each other, the pain beneath the anger. He'd told her the truth when he said she didn't know him if she thought he wanted her to leave. But had he ever really told her how he felt? Had he ever said the words that mattered most? That evening, Grant walked to the guest house, intending to knock on the door and ask to talk. But he could see through the window that Clara wasn't there. The lights were off, her car was gone. So he stood on the porch, hands in his pockets, and waited. When she still hadn't returned an hour later, he went back to his house. But something pulled him back to the guest house around 9. He walked up to the porch again, and this time he could see light glowing in the kitchen window. He was about to knock when he saw it, a piece of paper on the kitchen counter, clearly visible through the window. He leaned closer, squinting to read it. Flight confirmation, Seattle, Friday morning. Grant's heart stopped. She was leaving. She'd already bought the ticket. In 4 days, she'd be gone. He stood there on her porch for a long time, staring at that ticket, feeling something crack open in his chest. Part of him wanted to walk away, to protect himself from the rejection that was clearly coming. But Miguel's words came back to him. At least you tried. Grant straightened his shoulders and raised his hand to knock. He didn't know if Clara would listen. He didn't know if anything he said would change her mind. But he owed it to himself and to her to try, because sometimes the bravest thing you could do was fight for love, even when you weren't sure you'd win. December 3rd arrived cold and clear, the kind of Montana winter day where the sky stretches endless and blue above the snow-covered valley. Clara's suitcase sat by the door, fully packed for the second time in 4 months. This time, though, she wasn't running toward possibility. She was running away from fear. She'd spent the day in a kind of numb routine, organizing the office files so whoever came after her could find everything easily, writing detailed notes about supplier contacts and payment schedules. She'd said goodbye to Miguel and the ranch hands, offering vague explanations about family matters back in Seattle. They'd accepted her words with polite nods, but she'd seen the confusion in their eyes. They knew something had broken between her and Grant, even if they didn't understand what. Grant himself had been absent all day. She'd seen his truck leave early that morning and return late in the afternoon, but he hadn't come to the office, hadn't sought her out. The silence between them felt like a living thing, heavy and suffocating. Now, as sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Clara sat on her small couch with whiskey in her lap. The dog had been subdued all day, sensing something wrong, and Clara had held him close more than once, her tears dampening his scruffy fur. "I'm sorry," she whispered to him. "I'm sorry I keep uprooting you. I'm sorry I don't know what I'm doing." The knock at her door made her jump. Whiskey's ears perked up, and he wiggled free to run toward the sound, tail wagging hopefully. Clara wiped her eyes quickly, but she knew it was useless. She'd been crying on and off for hours, and her face showed it. She opened the door. Grant stood on her porch, his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, his expression raw and open in a way she'd never seen before. His eyes were red-rimmed, and there were new lines around his mouth that spoke to sleepless nights and hard thinking. "Can I come in?" His voice was rough, barely above a whisper. Clara nodded, stepping back. He entered slowly, his gaze immediately finding the packed suitcase by the door. Something flickered across his face. Pain, resignation, determination. But he didn't comment on it. They stood awkwardly in the small space until Clara gestured to the couch. "Do you want to sit?" "Please." They sat across from each other, the coffee table between them feeling like miles of distance. Whiskey settled at Grant's feet, clearly delighted to have them both in the same room again. The silence stretched, neither of them sure how to bridge the chasm that 3 days of hurt and fear had carved between them. Finally, Grant cleared his throat. "I need to tell you something. And I need you to just listen, all right? Don't say anything until I'm finished." Clara nodded, her throat too tight for words anyway. Grant leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together. When he spoke, his voice was steady but full of emotion. "When you showed up here 3 months ago with your dog and your apology, I was terrified. Not of you, of what you represented. The possibility of living again, of caring about someone again, of opening myself up to the kind of pain I swore I'd never let myself feel after Michael died." He paused, his jaw working. "I'd been existing, Clara, just going through motions, doing what needed to be done, convinced that was enough, that I didn't deserve more than that." Clara felt tears welling but stayed silent, letting him continue. "And then, there you were, with your sad eyes and your brave heart, asking for a chance. And I looked at you and I saw someone who'd been broken but hadn't stayed broken. Someone who'd lost everything and still had the courage to try again. You were everything I wasn't, and it scared me to death. But I couldn't turn you away, couldn't not give you a chance, even though I knew it would complicate my safe, controlled life." He looked up, met her eyes directly. "You brought me back, Clara, made me remember what it felt like to look forward to tomorrow, to laugh at something silly, to want more than just survival. You made me remember who I was before grief taught me to be careful." Grant stood, began pacing, the words coming faster now. "I'm not going to ask you to stay. I won't trap you with guilt or obligation or any kind of pressure. But before you leave, I need you to know something. I need you to know that I love you." The words hung in the air between them, simple and devastating. "Not because you needed me, not because you were convenient or grateful or any of the things you convinced yourself were true. I love you because of who you are. Because you're strong enough to rebuild your life from nothing. Because you're kind to a scruffy dog and patient with old ranchers and brave enough to trust again after being hurt. Because when you smile, it lights up everything around you. Because you see me, really see me, and you don't look away from the broken parts." Clara was openly crying now, tears streaming down her face, but Grant kept going, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "You're beautiful and smart and resilient, and loving you is the easiest thing I've ever done. It's the being afraid that's hard. But I'm done letting fear make my decisions for me. So here's my truth, Clara Whitmore. I love you. I want you to stay. I want to build a life with you, whatever that looks like. But more than that, I want you to be happy. And if happiness means leaving, if it means going back to Seattle and starting fresh without the weight of us, then I'll let you go. I'll miss you every day for the rest of my life, but I'll let you go." He stopped pacing, stood in front of her, and his voice dropped to barely a whisper. "But please don't leave because you're scared. Don't leave because you think what we have isn't real or isn't enough. It is real, it is enough, and it's worth fighting for even when it's terrifying." Clara couldn't speak. Her chest was so tight she could barely breathe, emotions crashing over her in waves. Love, fear, gratitude, shame, hope. She looked at Grant, at this good man who'd just laid his heart bare, who'd given her the truth without demanding anything in return. And she felt something inside her finally, completely break open. "I love you too," she choked out. "God, Grant, I love you so much." "Then why?" "Because I'm terrified." The words burst out of her, desperate and raw. "I'm terrified of losing you the way I lost Tom. Terrified of being that vulnerable again, of giving someone that much power to destroy me. What if something happens to you? What if I let myself need you, and then you're gone, and I'm alone again, and I can't survive it a second time?" Her whole body was shaking now, years of suppressed fear finally breaking through. Tom's death nearly killed me, Grant. It took everything I had just to keep breathing. And now, here you are, and I feel more for you than I thought I'd ever feel for anyone again. And it's wonderful and it's terrifying, because what if she couldn't finish? The sobs took over, and she buried her face in her hands. Grant moved immediately, crossing the space between them and sinking to his knees in front of the couch. He took her hands, pulled them gently away from her tear-stained face, and held them firmly in his own. "Look at me," he said softly. "Clara, look at me." She opened her eyes, met his gaze through her tears. "The fear is real," he said, his voice steady and sure. "I won't tell you it isn't. Life doesn't come with guarantees. I could lose you tomorrow. You could lose me. Either of us could walk out that door and never come back, and there's not a damn thing we can do to prevent it. That's the terrible truth of being alive. Then how—" Her voice broke. "How do you do it? How do you risk that kind of pain again? Because hiding from love isn't living, it's just existing. And I did that for 5 years, Clara. I know what that feels like. The safety of shutting down, of not letting anyone close enough to hurt you. But you know what? It hurt anyway. Being alone hurt. Having no one to share sunrise coffee with hurt. Going to bed every night in an empty house hurt. The pain was there whether I risked my heart or not." He squeezed her hands, his thumbs rubbing gentle circles on her palms. "I don't know how much time any of us have. Could be 50 years, could be 50 days. But I'd rather spend whatever time there is with you, really with you, fully present and vulnerable and alive, than spend it safe and alone. Because at least then I'd have something worth remembering. At least then I'd have loved and been loved, even if it ends up breaking me." Clara felt something shift deep in her chest, some locked door beginning to open. She looked down at their joined hands and saw her wedding ring catching the lamplight, still on her right hand where she'd moved it weeks ago. Tom's ring. Her ring, the symbol of 35 years of love and partnership and loss. "Wait," she said softly, pulling one hand free. She reached for Tom's journal, which sat on the side table where she'd left it that morning after reading it one more time. She opened it to the page she'd marked, the words she'd memorized but needed Grant to hear. "Tom wrote this 6 months before he died," she said, her voice trembling. "I need you to hear it." She read aloud, slowly and clearly, Tom's words about love not being finite, about not letting his death become her prison, about wanting her to find happiness again. When she reached the final lines, "If you've met someone who makes you smile again, who makes you feel alive again, then for God's sake, Clara, don't run. You deserve every happiness." Her voice cracked, but she kept going. When she finished, Grant's eyes were wet. "He sounds like he was a good man." He was. "He loved me well, and he wanted me to be loved well again." Clara closed the journal carefully, set it aside. Then, with shaking hands, she reached for her wedding ring. The band slipped off easily. She'd lost weight over the past year, and it no longer fit as snugly as it once had. She held it in her palm, the gold warm against her skin, and felt a wave of emotion so powerful it nearly knocked her over. "I'm not forgetting him," she said, looking at Grant through fresh tears. "I'm never going to forget him. He shaped who I am, taught me what love looks like, gave me 35 years of kindness and partnership. That doesn't go away just because I take off a ring. I know, but I'm choosing to live again, fully, not just surviving or going through motions, but really living. And that means," she swallowed hard, "that means choosing you, choosing us, choosing to be vulnerable and scared and brave all at once." She reached for the small wooden box on the side table where she kept a few precious things, her grandmother's locket, her mother's earrings. She opened it and placed the ring inside, nestling it carefully among the other treasures. Then she closed the lid with a soft click. The finality of it made her breath catch, but it also felt right, like releasing something she'd been holding too tightly, letting it transform from a chain into a cherished memory. "I'm not running," she said, meeting Grant's eyes. "I'm staying. If you still want me." She didn't get to finish. Grant pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, and it was exactly what she needed. She clung to him, both of them crying now, years of grief and fear and loneliness pouring out in a flood of relief. "I'm staying," she repeated. the words muffled against his shoulder. "I'm staying, Grant." He pulled back just enough to see her face, his hands cupping her cheeks, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "The ticket!" Clara pulled away gently and walked to the kitchen counter where the printed confirmation sat. She picked it up, held it for a moment as if saying goodbye to the fear it represented, then slowly, deliberately, tore it in half. Then in quarters, then into tiny pieces that scattered across the counter like confetti. "No more running," she said. They came together again, the embrace different this time, not desperate or grief-stricken, but solid and sure. Clara felt Grant's heartbeat against her chest, felt the strength in his arms, the warmth of his breath against her hair. This was real. This was right. This was choosing love over fear, choosing life over mere survival. Whiskey, who'd been watching the whole scene with confused interest, suddenly bounded over, apparently deciding that whatever was happening, he should be part of it. He wedged himself between their legs, tail wagging furiously, and they both laughed through their tears. Grant bent down and scooped up the dog, holding him against his chest, and Clara leaned into both of them, one hand on Grant's shoulder and the other scratching Whiskey's ears. They stood there in the small guest house, the three of them tangled together, and Clara felt something she hadn't felt in over a year. Complete. Whole. Home. "Stay?" Grant asked, even though she'd already answered. "Not in the guest house, not as an employee. Stay with me. Build a life with me. Let's figure out what forever looks like when we're brave enough to reach for it." "Yes," Clara whispered, the word barely audible but carrying the weight of a vow. "Yes, I'm staying. I'm choosing this. I'm choosing us." Grant set Whiskey down gently and pulled Clara close again, his hands framing her face with infinite tenderness. "I love you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I love you so much. I love you too." This time when he kissed her, it was different from all the kisses before. It was deeper, hungrier, full of promise and commitment, and the sweet relief of two people who'd almost lost each other, but found their way back. Clara kissed him back with everything she had, pouring into it all the words she didn't know how to say, all the hope she'd been too afraid to feel. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Grant rested his forehead against hers. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft and silent, covering the world in white. Inside, two broken hearts were healing, choosing to try again, choosing to believe that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was simply stay and love, and let yourself be loved in return. "Come home with me," Grant murmured. "Tonight, tomorrow, always." Clara smiled through her tears. "Yes," she said again, the word becoming easier each time, less frightening, more like the beginning of something beautiful than the end of something safe. "Yes." Spring arrived at the Delaney ranch with the kind of glory that makes Montana worth enduring the bitter winters. The snow retreated gradually, revealing grass so green it looked painted, and wildflowers began dotting the meadows in bursts of purple and yellow and white. The aspens leafed out in that particular shade of green that exists nowhere else, and the air smelled of earth and growth and possibility. Clara sat in one of the rocking chairs on Grant's front porch. Their front porch now, cradling a mug of coffee and watching the sun climb over the mountains. 6 months had passed since that December night when she'd torn up a plane ticket and chosen to stay. 6 months that felt both impossibly long and startlingly brief, packed with quiet moments of joy and the gradual, gentle work of building a shared life. She lifted her right hand and watched morning light catch on the simple silver band she wore. Grant had given it to her on Christmas morning, his mother's ring that he'd kept safe all these years. It wasn't an engagement ring. They'd agreed they didn't need to rush toward marriage, not when every day already felt like a commitment renewed. But it was a promise, a symbol of belonging, and Clara touched it often, still marveling that she got to wear it. The ranch had changed over the winter and into spring, shaped by their combined vision. Clara had spent January completely overhauling the accounting system, implementing software that made everything more efficient and transparent. In February, she'd researched and secured 2 grants for sustainable ranching practices, rainwater collection, and rotational grazing programs that would benefit the land and the bottom line. Grant had been amazed, then grateful, then proud in a way that made her cheeks flush with pleasure. But more than the practical improvements, there were the changes that spoke to healing. Grant had converted one of the unused barns into a community riding center, offering free lessons to kids from low-income families. It was the kind of program Michael would have loved, a living memorial that helped rather than just remembered. Clara had watched Grant teach his first class in March, seen the way his face lit up when a shy 10-year-old girl finally cantered on her own. And she'd fallen in love with him all over again. The sound of claws on wood drew her attention. Whiskey bounded up the porch steps, no longer a puppy, but a full-grown dog now, all lean muscle and boundless energy. His scruffy coat had filled out, and his eyes were bright and clever. Around his neck hung a new collar, leather, well made, with a tag that read, Whiskey Delaney. Delaney Ranch, followed by both Clara and Grant's phone numbers. Grant had ordered the tag in January, and when it arrived, Clara had cried. Such a small thing, a dog tag with both their names. But it represented everything. A joined life, a shared future. The understanding that what they'd built together was permanent, even without wedding vows or legal documents. Whiskey nudged her hand with his nose, demanding attention, and Clara obliged, scratching behind his ears the way he liked. "Good morning, handsome boy. Were you helping Grant with the morning check?" "He was supervising," Grant's voice came from the doorway. Very intently, she turned to smile at him. He stood backlit by the interior lights of the house, carrying 2 fresh mugs of coffee and wearing the flannel shirt she'd given him for his birthday. His hair was slightly mussed, and he hadn't shaved yet, and he looked so perfectly, wonderfully real that her heart squeezed with gratitude. He handed her one of the mugs and settled into the rocking chair beside hers, close enough that their shoulders touched. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the day wake up around them. This had become their ritual. Morning coffee on the porch, whiskey at their feet, mountains standing eternal witness. "Clara never grew tired of it," Doris called, Grant said eventually. "She wants us to come to dinner Saturday. Says she's making her famous pot roast, and she won't take no for an answer." Clara laughed. "Let me guess, she also wants to discuss wedding plans?" She mentioned it might come up in conversation. Doris had fully embraced her role as the matchmaker responsible for their happiness, conveniently forgetting that Clara had found the job listing on her own and shown up at the ranch without any assistance. She visited regularly, always with pie or cookies or unsolicited advice, and Clara had grown genuinely fond of her. The whole town had, in fact, embraced their relationship with varying degrees of enthusiasm and nosiness. Even Helen Morrison had softened, admitting over coffee at the church social that she might have been hasty in her judgment. "What did you tell her?" Clara asked. "That we'd love to come to dinner and that she should mind her own business about wedding plans." "How did that go over?" "She laughed and told me I was stubborn as my father," Grant grinned. "Then she said that when we do decide to get married, she expects to be invited." Clara reached over and laced her fingers through his. Marriage was something they'd discussed in abstract terms, both agreeing that they'd know when the time was right. For now, this was enough, waking up together, building a life together, choosing each other every single day. "The piece of paper could wait, I was thinking," Grant said, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on her hand. "Maybe we should get another dog, keep Whiskey company, and..." He smiled, knowing she could read him now. "And maybe look into fostering. There's a program in Billings for kids who need temporary placements. With all the space we have here, the ranch work that teaches responsibility..." He paused, suddenly uncertain. "What do you think?" Clara felt warmth spread through her chest. They'd talked about this before. The ache of a house too big and too quiet, the desire to fill it with life and laughter. She'd never had children of her own, and Grant had assumed that ship had sailed. But fostering, giving kids a safe place, even temporarily, felt right in a way she couldn't articulate. "I think that sounds perfect," she said softly. "I think it sounds exactly right." They sat together as the sun climbed higher, making plans and dreaming dreams, their coffee growing cold in forgotten mugs. Clara thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, terrified, convinced she was too broken to love again, ready to run from the best thing to happen to her in years. She'd come so close to letting fear win, to choosing safety over vulnerability, loneliness over risk. But she'd stayed, and staying had changed everything. Behind the house, in the garden she'd planted last month, flowers were beginning to bloom. She'd used seeds from Tom's mother's garden, saved all these years in a tin she'd found while unpacking. Planting them had felt like bringing her past and present together, honoring what had been while nurturing what could be. Tom would have approved, she thought. He'd have liked Grant, would have been glad she'd found someone to share her days with. "Hey," Grant said, interrupting her thoughts. "I need to check the water troughs in the north pasture. Want to come?" Always. They stood together, whistling for Whiskey, who bounded ahead toward the barn with joyful abandon. Grant took Clara's hand as they walked. Their steps matched and easy, and she felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. This was home. This was love. This was the life she'd been brave enough to claim. The mountains watched over them, patient and eternal, as they made their way across the ranch. Whiskey darted ahead, chasing shadows and scents, while Clara and Grant walked slowly, in no particular hurry to reach anywhere. Life stretched ahead of them, uncertain and full of promise. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara wasn't afraid of what came next. She'd learned something important over these past months. It was never too late to begin again. Never too late to risk your heart, to choose vulnerability over safety, to believe that good things might still be waiting in the chapters you hadn't written yet. Sometimes the bravest thing you could do was simply stay. Stay when every instinct screamed to run. Stay when fear whispered that you'd be hurt again. Stay and let yourself be loved back to life, one quiet morning at a time. Clara squeezed Grant's hand, and he squeezed back, and they kept walking together toward whatever came next.